We want to welcome you all to the first of our new quarterly virtual speaker series, Winter Brainstorm. This series is sponsored by the Kessler Foundation as part of our TBI Model System Grant, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Tara Buggie. In her almost 25 years as an individual with brain injury, Tara has found herself intrigued by the human brain's ability to endure injury and instilled in her a need for answers, a need to know. 2 years after her traumatic brain injury, she began the law school program that she was accepted while in a coma and began her love of research and writing. She went on to work assisting judges at the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, the U.S. Department of Education's General Counsel's Office, and the New Jersey Superior Court. She continued her love for research-based expertise in a brief career in private practice before redirecting her focus on brain injury and neuroscience research and writing. Tara has spent the last decade studying neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology, particularly the self and impaired self-awareness. Tara is actively involved with the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. She is speaking today on reclaiming self after brain injury, hope for a new self. Thank you, Tara, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you also to the Kessler Foundation for this outstanding invitation to speak to many people who have given me the middle of their day on Thursday. Thank you also. Self after brain injury is such an essential and relatively unrecognized topic. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty. The reason why it's newsworthy, of course, it's January, and so everyone wants a new self or self-improvement of some kind. The resolutions abound. Though some of us, even those without brain injury, are facing a prospect of a new self that they didn't make resolution for. Those facing long COVID who've lost abilities or roles in life as a result of cognitive impairments that they're just right now navigating for the first time, are looking at the topic of self in a whole new way. Let's see. There we are. Itself is a hot topic. COVID-19, National Geographic's running articles or a news story. Can COVID-19 change your personality? Which is another word for self. Here's what brain research has to say. The Harvard Health Publishing talks about the tragedy of long COVID. Neuroscience is also finding self a compelling topic right now because it's closer than it's ever been to bridging the gap between self and the brain. That explanatory gap, as Jason Tagow says in his book, The Elusive Brain. We see articles just from last month, how the brain preserves self, or Discover Magazine talking about brain scientists probe the mechanisms behind self-identity. Myself, when Jeannie offered the opportunity to pick a topic of my choice, I chose self because it was such a poignant part of what I call the inside of my recovery. Self-awareness, as Jeannie said, is something that I've studied for a decade, and I've always marveled at the fact that the recovery experience, the true essence of the experience, is a total secret to anyone on the outside, what I call the outside. Oliver Sacks in '85 talked about, in his bestseller, Man Who Mistook His Way for a Hat, talked about the experience of impaired self-awareness as totally unfathomable, inconceivable was the word he used, even to the most sensitive observer. He is a sensitive observer because he knows what he's looking for, but couldn't conceive of the experience. The research I've done for today, I was very pleasantly surprised to read an allusion to the experience of the subjective experience of recovery as in the inside. So somebody's getting it. And then I was further excited by the fact that a lot of the research shows that the subjective experience of the patient is going to be part of the equation of certainly improved treatment, but possibly, and I propose, and I make the case today, for a return to self, the new self. The brain injured will be part of the equation of returning or getting to be a self that they longed for. So the experience of loss of self is, oh, we skipped one, I think. There we are, sorry. Who are we talking about? The World Health Organization did a research in 2018 of the global, an estimate of the global epidemic of brain injury. They focused solely on traumatic brain injury, which is the silent epidemic. So we see that 69 million in the world experience traumatic brain injury, but they also noted the 30 million that experience central nervous system brain injury, and then the 6.9 that experience stroke in the world. And they noted also that those numbers were underestimates, just because of the collection of data and how it's sort of a war and things complicated to get the exact numbers. In my own living experience, as I prepared for this, just a few weeks, came to know two more. The young man who helped me with the printer, my war with the printer, said, "Oh, I sustained traumatic brain injury." And then just last night, a friend of mine was collecting money for a friend of hers who just had a brain aneurysm. It really is everywhere. And luckily, we are surviving it. The advances in medicine are letting us live. Unfortunately, we're living with disabilities. Though chronic, some of them are, they are subtle. Memory, attention, emotion, language, energy, all of these impairments or challenges, of all of them, the one agreed on by most is the loss of sense of self. Potentially the most enduring change after brain injury, I can't see that, relates to the subjective experience of who someone is and who someone is seen to be. The loss of sense is so common. In fact, let's see, move you guys so I can see. In fact, that it is been described as being the almost sine qua non, which is Latin for essential, of brain injury. Where have I gone? Let's see. Okay, so now we're gonna go to a map. Here we are. Before we get into the Latin, before we get into the nitty gritty of that kind of stuff, we're gonna just lay out how we're gonna do it. Our roadmap must be preceded by my heads up that this is not a how-to. We can't do that for brain injury, right? Brain injury is by the experts described as the word heterogeneity. Every injury is too different. They're as different as their recoveries are. So this is not a how to reclaim self. I'm going to share my story with you and make the case that we have a lot to look forward to about the alliance between science, psychology, and the patient with the subjective experience. So we're going to look at science briefly. I am going to just tell you a bit about two common conditions often resulting from brain injury. The covering it isn't. I'm not a neuroscientist, so we're going to be relatively broad, and I'm going to go as fast as I can. So stay with me. I'm not keep up with me, but don't mute me when we go into the science, because it'll be for a lot of the presentation. We're going to talk about the self generally. Then we're going to talk about the loss of sense of self, which is the first of the two conditions. Then we're going to talk about the importance of the patient voice in treatment of the loss of sense of self. And then we're going to talk about impaired self-awareness, which is the second condition. And then the importance of the patient voice in the impaired self-awareness treatment. Then we'll talk about the advances, and I'll and through all of this, and after, and part of advances, I'll weave my story to sort of demonstrate the evidence of the importance of the patient voice and the importance of both the patient voice and the advances in the returning to self. And then, as Jeannie said, we'll have 20 minutes for questions. So here's this fine print. The fine print is that I'm not a neuroscientist, as I said earlier. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a survivor, which, as we'll talk about today, gives me and some of you and a unique perspective on the topic of self that science now says means a lot, which is terrific. These topics have taken centuries to understand, so our discussion is going to be a survey of them. I invite correction. If there are any professionals out there who can share and start this alliance, start this patient neuroscience psychology alliance, I invite correction in the 20 minutes at the end. I've included annotations in my slides, so feel free to screenshot them or ask for them later. That's the disclaimer. So let's get to the science. Oh, we skipped one. Okay, so talking about self. This is my first slide for self. Yes. I'm going to start with an introduction to the topic of self with my first experience of self in my brain injury recovery. I was early in my rehabilitation. I was a resident of the more acute half of the, I think, third floor hall. And I was coming back from occupational therapy, sitting in a wheelchair, being pushed by a transport is what they were called. And whatever it was about either the therapy or the transport's kind words behind me or something, I looked in my lap and realized that I had no idea why I was there, because I didn't remember what brought me there. And as we'll see later, when we talk about the different kinds of loss of self, Mahari Nochi is the gentleman or the person that we're going to list the kinds of loss of self. Lists one of them as a loss of, it's related to memory, related to amnesia. So because of my amnesia, I was missing this very foundational piece that went to who I was. And so at that moment, in that time, because I had short-term memory loss, I had the experience, started crying. The nurse wrote this note down that you're looking at. If you can, I'll read it for you. The handwriting may be difficult. Alert and restless. When patient was working with occupational therapist, patient became tearful and kept stating she doesn't have her memory. I'll put the RY at the end for you. And I only remembered the moment because it was stamped in my brain and I could read it here and share it with you. But this experience of self is so incredibly, the loss of self is so incredibly poignant, important, but almost indescribable, right? So let's get to it where we can look at words that describe it. There it is. Bow, huge mess, not mess, but very complicated. This is my creation of a visual based on what Jane Beadle, Tamara Owensworth, and Jennifer Fleming, they did a review of the impact of what TBI does to self. They call self nebulous. I think this is a good picture of nebulous. We see that there are contradictions inside of it, consistent, evolving, independence and relationships, past, present, future, your possible self. There are also, so this big nebulous thing is a result of many different schools of thought, right? We have philosophy, we have Descartes. I think therefore I am. Then we have in psychology, Freud, id, superego, unconscious, conscious. And we also have neurology, right? They're involved. According to neuroscience, or the second bullet, self emerges from a brain as a product of biology and culture. I'm not really sure. The picture, the first bullet says that self is a major weakness, an enigma for cognitive science. Why is it so hard? The picture is, I don't know if anyone remembers, back in 2017, the viral dress image. Is it, I think the story was, is it black or is it blue? But that looks white to me. So it was about perception and how you perceive the dress. And what was so complicated about it was that I can't see what you can see. You can't what you see. So therein lies the problem, right? And for neuroscience, do we have? Oh no. For neuroscience, their situation is that they measure things, right? They're quantitative. They want to see it in the brain. Unfortunately or fortunately, they see it everywhere in the brain. They had the idea that it's, or there's an idea that self is one entity. What is self? What is that thing, self? But it's because it's in so many parts of the brain. I don't know. It's difficult for science to get its hand around, and that's called the explanatory gap, which I referred to earlier. It's essentially that neuroscience can't explain the subjective experience with physicality. Okay, so then we're going to go to that experience. The sense of self is by Jane Beadle. She did a 2021 study where the patient she was treating for loss of sense of self, that was her major. It wasn't, she didn't have a major amnesia problem. She didn't have a major speech problem. Her most important loss was sense of self. And so the study goes into the topic, and Jane Beadle defines it as the mental process that provides, there should be an S, one with the feeling of singularity, coherence, individuality, and unity that defines one as unique and a unique and particular human being. She did say, though, that self changes. Self changes, right? Of course it does. She had in her discussion that there are a number of events that change self, the non-injured, anyone's self, a neurological event, as we're discussing today, a major life transition, which is could be a stressful event, like becoming a parent, would change yourself. You're no longer, I don't know, what do you say? You're no longer going out to bars and partying. You're home making dinner, or you're responsible for these people who are your children. So your self is either complemented by new characteristics or it changed. Social evaluation, which is feedback on you as a person, also changes yourself. And then psychotherapy targeting self-schema. Those are the many ways that self changes. So if self changes in those ways, what is it about brain injury that's different? Why is parenting not the trauma that, I'm joking. There was also a study that I read about hockey players who, it was actually in the concussion journal, about hockey players, professional hockey players who sustained numerous concussions and needed to stop the profession. And I wondered, as I read the study, it did mention loss of sense of self, but I wondered, isn't this just about an out of shape athlete changing careers or finishing his career? And it's not, because of the more further reasons that Tamara Owensworth in her book about self-identity after brain injury and Jane Beadle list. They say, do I have it? No. That the change of self that people who do not sustain the first of the four experience is actually a very complex neurological process that we don't know is happening. And it involves your memory, and it involves reconciling your old self and your new self. And it involves self-awareness of your awareness of how you perform activities or your ability, and it involves processing of memories. So if you can think for a second about the challenges that those essential things that are essential to the complex process. If your memory isn't working, and your executive or your reasoning isn't working, or you whatever it is that would make you be able to reconcile an old self versus a new self, the ability to adapt, to sort of gracefully update is the word Mrs. Owensworth uses, to update yourself, which happens normally for other people as a woman becomes a mother. You actually can't do it. So, and that's part of the reason why people with brain injury who describe the loss of self and they're playing with the sense of loss of self, is they can't quite describe what it is, but something's missing, which is what we said earlier. And so what do we, let's see, where are we? Loss of sense of self. Are we here yet? How is loss of sense of self work? Yes, here we are. Great. Maharu Nochi in '98 discussed the types of loss of self after brain injury. And as we said earlier, the loss of clear knowledge of self, you have the amnesia, you can't understand your present self, opaqueness of self. If you don't understand your condition, the void that someone feels, sometimes the amnesia can be great. So if a woman, there's an example of a woman who in the year prior to her injury changed jobs, and she couldn't remember having performed her job for a year. That's pretty impactful in your understanding of yourself. So the opaqueness of self, understanding of cognitive and emotional, what am I? Nochi heard a woman talk about herself in the third person, so foreign that you're not even talking about me. And then the loss of self by comparison, which is actually the most common, whether or not they understand the difference between the past self and the current self, the old me and the new me, and the old future and the new future, new goals. And the loss of sense of self in the eyes of others. The impact of brain injury on self has been called catastrophic. So we sort of are getting like a little taste of it. We know what self is, we know what sense of self is, we know different kinds of loss of sense of self. So loss of sense of self, what is it exactly? There it is. It is, so not a definition, but they're elements, sort of like law school. What are the elements? And we're using this really powerful language. So the first is self-estrangement, like estranged from yourself. Conscious awareness that on the part of the survivor that they're just not the same person. Number two, the survivor makes a negative evaluation, which goes back to the old me, new me, and then and when they make that comparison, they see that the old me was better. So the negative evaluation, like, mathematically, the negative of the current me. And because of that, they experience emotional distress. These are the elements of loss of sense of self. And the final element is denial. In order to avoid the experience of emotional distress, they deny, or by protecting themselves. It's a protective response in the face of increasing recognition, which is awareness, which is really important to this kind of loss of self, of the two. This is the awareness side of things. Awareness, because loss of sense of self has to do with the more mild brain injury, concussion. Even the hockey players who were, not the repeated concussions are nothing, but it is a mild brain injury. So okay, so you might say, one might say that denial, all right, it's solved. We just deny the emotional of it and everything's fine. And unfortunately, ignorance is not bliss. It's well established that increased awareness, increased self-awareness, which you would think is good, leads to emotional distress. Ignorance is not bliss. The reality, what happens when you deny? The patient who's in denial of their new self, of the self that has the impairments, they won't go to rehab. They won't pursue rehab, and ultimately, if they don't, they deteriorate further. Then, cognitive rehab has to do with restoring, and if they don't pursue restoration of their abilities, cognitive or behavioral or physical, they'll deteriorate further. Poor psychological adjustment, which is depression, which makes sense, even if you're denying it unconsciously. The poor psychological adjustment occurs when you experience situations that present challenge to the new self. And then what happens is the new self avoids those situations so that even the abilities that the new self retained aren't put to use, which is an overall diminished quality of life. Neuroscience obviously has had a vested interest in figuring this out, right? How did they start to do it? They looked at patients who, because there are some patients who manage to navigate the threats to self after brain injury. How do they do it? Positive self-identity after brain injury. So let's see, patients have positive identity experiences after brain injury. Nochi in 98 looked at 10 survivors and analyzed how they proceed through life, even despite their impairments and their history of brain injury. He saw that they revise, in quotation marks, they revise their self-narratives. Some say, things could, sitting in a physical therapy room, unhappy about the experience, looking across the room and seeing someone who's also going through therapy who has no legs. Well, things could be worse. Protesting therapy is the second. Recognizing the impairment, but said other factors added to the unhappiness. Growth of self. The effects of TBI were negative, but it's given me growth for the future. Living for the self here and now, looking at selves without comparison to anyone else, and then the recovering self. So the part of the narrative is, so this was like a blip in my life, and I'm going to, the end of the story is that I recover, and that hope, which is a capital letters word, that hope that gets you to the end of the story is what allows them to successfully proceed and have a positive self-identity despite their brain injury. The way Nochi describes self-narrative, sort of a not so clear term. Self-narrative is a story constructed with language which meaningfully connects concrete events and has a beginning and an end and a unique and reflects unique perspectives. Okay, so rehabilitation and the course of neuroscience. How can we? Oh, right. Neuroscience said, so that's good. That works out. How can we create that? What treatment can we give to patients who can help them revise their self-narratives to avoid this omnipotent and commonly shared loss of sense of self that impacts rehabilitation, right? And many different approaches were considered or were tried and considered. And as late as 2021, the study that I referred to about the patient who was most important or most the symptom that affected her most was loss of sense of self. In that study, the author said that after 20 years of studying the lived experience, the method of exactly how to treat that is still not clear. And we understand, we talked earlier about why it's complicated for neuroscience and for psychology. In '99, Damaso, who's like a major neurology neuroscientist, he found self in the brain. Okay, so it's neurosciences, so we should come up with what it is. There's sort of like a turf war going on, and there has been for a long time, since well, we'll get to that. And so the contrary study is, or the counter study is, that in 2016, Beadle finds that or concludes in her study that loss of sense of self isn't really a neurologically created thing. It's actually this social experience outside of the survivor that causes the feeling of loss of sense of self, and that can be fixed with social stuff. We're not going to worry about treating the brain for it. The problem is the subjective experience, right? And the unattainability of the subjective experience. So how do we treat? So we referred to the turf war. We talked about cognitive abilities in quant terms, the difficulty of measuring, and the subjective experience. We've got a new color and asterisk after subjective experience. Are we on slide 18? I have to move you guys again. Excuse me while I move you because I can't see my slide. There it is. How do we capture the subjective experience of brain injury? They tried, they being neuroscience, tried all different studies. Do we treat sense of self with the same gender? Do we treat sense of self amongst like a population, students? Do we deal with hockey players? Do we treat them? Do we promote group affiliation? And the narrative approach that's stayed is the 98 thinking about self-narrative. It had staying power, and the narrative. Let's see, the narratives enable the narrative. Nucci describes narratives enable the entry into the insider experience as, I've got to move you again because I can't see, as the life world or inner meaning or inner world of meaning. Also pretty exciting for me to read, but also impactful. Sarah D. Morris wrote this incredibly, it was 2004 article, but incredibly, I'm gonna put you back on the top because I still can't see. What's the story here? Apologies. Okay. And then
I don't want to interrupt you, Tara. I just want to tell you got about 10 minutes left, and then time.
Then we've got to speed through. So we're going to jump to self-narrative and the subjective experience. That was not my experience. My daughter refers to the stories of the way I describe my recovery experience as the Grey's Anatomy version of loss of sense of self, loss of self. The type that I'm referring to is Oliver Sacks referred to it as the world of Arabian Nights. Neuroscience still calls the experience of impaired self-awareness a phenomenon because they can't get their hands around it. So as I begin my storytelling of my 97 brain injury that I sustained on the way home from attendance at a brain injury benefit for, here we go, an international rock star survivor, now friend, who had been shot in the head by a later to be revealed terrorist. It's a wonderful unlikely recovery story that we don't have time for. So I need to give you the quick summary of impaired self-awareness, the Grey's Anatomy stuff. Here, are we gonna go fast through this? Where are we? Oh, no, I've gone too far. Apologies again. I'm giving you the end of the story. Implications of self-awareness. I'm looking for slide 19. Here it is. Here we are. Okay, anosognosia. That's what Oliver Sacks was looking at back in '85. Because they had not decided, neuroscience had not identified impaired self-awareness as something that was partial anosognosia. It is the clinical phenomenon in which the brain dysfunctional patient does not appear to be aware of their impaired neurological or neuropsychological function, which is obvious to the clinician or other reasonably attentive individual. Impaired self-awareness is defined below. Use of the term impaired self-awareness is to describe a partial syndrome of disturbed function. And that has to do with the way the person who's unaware responds to a clinician telling them, no, you're actually paralyzed. And the patient with anosognosia, which is more global experience, would just not listen, meaning just not respond to that kind of feedback. Whereas someone with impaired self-awareness would be perplexed, or they may even respond with something that's like a figuring of it. Let me find, okay, here we are. So the definition of impaired self-awareness, we did that. What does it mean? Okay, so you overestimate your ability. So, right. So my experience was, all right. All right. So impaired self-awareness can affect. So you have limited awareness of your ability. You're unaware of your impairments, and you have high self-esteem because you're not. Sort of like denial, but different. Because you are not. Your responses aren't angry or defensive. Let's see, it can occur as a result of many different kinds of neurological impairment, not just traumatic brain injury, which is what I sustained. It's also common to stroke. So it can affect paralysis, speech, memory, unawareness of all of these things. The patient is unaware. For me, in addition to the many cognitive impairments that go along with traumatic brain injury, I had aphasia, which is an impairment of my language ability. And so being unaware of the sound of the language coming out of my mouth, this is also difficult to read, but it's my speech and language. It says, overall, patient needs maximum assistance for basic communication, and max to total for social communication. Patient denies deficits in communication. That's for one kind of aphasia. Wernicke is fluent, so gobbledygook, coming out, words, replacing words, just coming out. And people would say to me, slow down. And I figured at one point that I was in the South because the nurses were speaking to me slowly, and everyone always told me, oh, people from New Jersey talk too fast. And so I was, okay, I must be in the South, because the impaired awarenesses that go along with brain injury also have to do with environment and time and place, separate. So here we are on slide 22. Another part of speech was that I was speaking Spanglish, and I don't know how to speak Spanish. So this says that the nurse's notes say that I requested for the Spanish channel to be put on. Totally unaware of these things. In addition to the killer nurses, the abusive, perceived abusive physical therapists, not knowing my head was shaved, not knowing a lot of things about myself. I didn't know, and not knowing that I had not paralysis, but weakness on the left side, and deciding that the therapist was trying to hurt me. Sort of a dramatic story. We're gonna, okay, here's the MASH, because George Prigatano is the guru on impaired self-awareness and anosognosia. He describes this crazy situation where the traumatic brain, he says the situation for the traumatic brain injury survivor is much more complicated for a lot more reasons, because of all of the unawarenesses of time and place that I described. He says, so he describes patients do not have any recollection of what happened to them, and they're convinced they don't need to be in the hospital. They may report no cognitive impairments. During their hospital stays, they may literally be walking around giving elaborate explanations as to why they're in the hospital. For example, a patient who was an aspiring actor indicated that he was in the hospital, he was not in the hospital, but rather in a movie set depicting MASH. And the doctors and nurses were on the set as actors. So how is this guy going to get treated? Implications. Again, the decreased motivation for physical therapy or rehabilitation therapy, depression, and caregiver distress. How do you help someone who doesn't need to be helped? Here is more notes of mine saying that I thought at first I was there playing because I pulled a muscle in soccer, which is the only time I'd been to the hospital before this. And at the bottom, I say, I feel fine, totally fine. Okay, so impaired self-awareness in 2020. So we know about the surfboard. We know about all of the complications of the winding of denial and that kind of thing. In 2020, George Prigatano describes impaired self-awareness as the failure to experience a disturbance of higher integrative brain functions due to a disruption or damage to the regions of the brain and performance of higher integrative, right? So failure to experience. So we're starting to get a whiff of the importance of the experience. At the bottom, we see the evolution. There's Oliver Sacks, no idea, no conception, not possible. I was starting to describe Sarah Morris, who described this really complicated time in treatment where brain injury was irreparable. Patients weren't being hopelessly treated sort of for not really to recover, but to cope, but to sort of live with life as this new self. Then we go to study of anosognosia, which is George Prigatano talking about, he says, apologies. Okay, I'm just going to do it. Then we talk about, he talks about recognition of the experience of the patient who can't pick up the cup because she's paralyzed on one side. And she says something like, I had to trust my feelings. Okay, and then he says, a subjective description, a patient description of the subjective experience would help us. That was in 2011. 2018. Jason Tagout gets really into the subjective experience and the bridging of the divide. And then in 2020, 2 years ago, George Prigatano comes and says, slide me on 25, let me catch up.
Tara, we have about 15 minutes left. I don't know if you have a wrap up slide or if you want
really?
questions.
Okay. So, yeah. Look at that. I told you I was verbose. So quickly, this talks about how there were my rehabilitation in 97, none of this progress was happening yet. That I was contending, that's the word there, contending, defensive maybe, that maybe I was in this experience of denial because I was more aware that I was going to go to law school. So what happens? So here we are. So George Prigatano says, the last little box was this paper that was so exciting, just like the Morris paper, that he says neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and where is it? Neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and neuropsychological rehabilitation is a new era. So we look at neuroplasticity. What are all the findings post 97? They discover that neuroplasticity happens in the adult brain. The adult brain can grow new brain cells, and that learning promotes neurogenesis, that voluntary exercise, running, specifically running, promotes cell growth. The cell growth happens in a new challenging environment. And then brain injury increases cell production 3 to 4 times. All of that was discovered with this neuroimaging. And Prigutone is really excited that these machines can give us actual evidence that the training that they provided, that rehabilitation can give us, I'm just gonna read it, potential evidence that more than compensatory training may occur as a result of rehabilitation activities. So I propose that is so is the last slide here? I know that's the last one. So right, so wrapping up. And I'm sorry that I missed so much. In closing, with George Prigodono's quote, we note that he recognizes the importance of the subjective patient experience, as he said in his 2011 book. He says this, and then the presentation today was supposed to, and I hope it did, suggest that there is an alliance now. The turf war is over, and the turf war is over because it also includes the patient. And I hope my presentation has made you as hopeful as I am about the newish alliance, and it will mean a return. It will soon mean a new self. Brevity is not my thing.
Well, thank you, Tara. That was, it's certainly a very complex topic.
Dense, for sure. Dense, for
yeah,
sure.
A great job at handling it. So maybe you could just stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And so we have about 10 minutes, and we can open things up for questions now. So there's a couple of ways you can ask questions for Tara. First, you can use the raise your hand feature. To do this, you want to click on participants on the bottom of the page. And when that opens, there'll be a raise your hand button you can press. And one of us will call on you to ask Tara your question to Tara. Second, if you'd like, you can type your question in the chat, and one of us will ask Tara the question for you. So does anyone have anything they would like to say to Tara, or any questions for Tara? We can open it up.
More time to finish. Just let her go. She'll just go, which is true. I'm just going to fill the time just because we're waiting. And when you see questions, just tell me to be quiet.
Okay.
Yeah. So the thesis of today was that this self, which includes ability that's treated through cognitive rehab, they're improving the cognitive rehab with all of these advances, including involving the patient, so that self will be something that the survivor is part of recapturing. We're still waiting. Okay.
I'm Thomas Quinlan. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, Thomas. I'm so glad you're here.
Thomas,
we were talking about you earlier.
I'm trying to find a flag, so I'm going to give up. I want to say the introduction of you was absolutely fabulous, and I wasn't disappointed after hearing you speak. You have a real life experience with TBI, which in my 9 years of experience is a rarity to talk to somebody who actually is fighting the same battle we are and can speak like you do. I appreciate all that you've done in your life to be able to do this. And you've been an absolute blessing and encouragement to me. And I hope we can get a recording of this thing.
You're too kind, Thomas. Thank you.
I'm not too kind. Thank you, but I'll take that. But I want to dish back out to you how wonderful it is to hear you speak. It was just, makes you feel like you're not alone.
You're one of millions. And
I know we are, but still, we don't get to talk to the millions. We usually talk to somebody who thinks they know what they're talking about. You know what you're talking about, and it comes over loud and clear. Thank you, and I'll sign off.
Thank you.
We have a question. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Thomas, don't feel discouraged, because in my opinion, the move toward understanding the patient experience is going to happen. It's happening. It's important now.
Yeah, I'm not discouraged at all. I'm totally uplifted by this.
Good.
Thank you.
So there is a question in the chat. It's from Jenna, and it says, Tara, can you describe how you felt that your sense of self has changed over time in your recovery?
Over time, over the long time. I think that if one were to say in 1996 that Tara will experience traumatic brain injury, the person would say, she'll eat it up, something like that. Because I had strength of character for sure, and the research says that personality is part of it. And which doesn't mean that it was not a hiccup for me. It was life altering. I was in a different world where I didn't know my head was shaved. I didn't know, and I was functioning and talking to people and just not in the same world. So that sort of doesn't look like a blip. For sure, it was on that no-T list. Had the experiences of coping, the revising of the self-narratives. I think I probably am the person who was the growth person who was living out this has made me a better person. I think that may have caused me to appreciate other people's life experiences more than I would have otherwise. Being an advocate now it sort of goes along, it's like right in line with the law school thing, right? Being, representing someone. So, but being an advocate for brain injury is, it means something, whereas being a lawyer representing a client doesn't go to your personality, or doesn't go to your beliefs, or doesn't go to your values or your lived experience, sort of thing. I think for sure it's made me a better person, stronger person.
Michael Greenwald has a question. So Michael, if you want to unmute yourself and ask Tara your question.
I just had to unmute myself. The speech I enjoyed very much, and I'm very proud of you.
Oh, you're so kind.
I want to say a lot of people who are listening, I'm sure, are undergoing or have undergone brain injury. And I wanted to know, why was it that in all the after effects that you have when you have a brain injury, your sense of self was the one that stood out? That really baffled me. How was that?
Of the fact that sense of self, so of all the research, do you mean for me or for people generally?
You, yeah.
I mean, go back to the wheelchair where I'm looking in my lap. I have no idea how I got where. I'm suddenly disabled and I have no idea why. It's sort of like your foundation. I've never been an orphan, but say you, the basic, and it goes to impaired self-awareness too, right? Not knowing who you are, or like literally not being able to hear yourself, right? And literally not being able to see yourself, because mirrors appeared and disappeared for me. I didn't, my head was shaved, but I was Who knew? The nurse in the second room, which was months into it, lifted my hair and said, "Oh, it's growing in." And I said, "What do you?" And I assumed she doesn't know who I'm just that other patient. She doesn't know. She's mistaking me for. I said, "What are you? What are you talking about?" And she lifted up my hair, and I almost fell out. I almost fell out of the chair. That's loss of sense of self. Sense of self is like, I know who I am. I know what I look like. I know what I sound like. I know where I'm going. I know where I came from. None of it.
But nobody agreed with you. That was it. Was that the main thing? Things that you thought were available were just not there.
Do you mean that when people would tell me to slow down speaking?
Anything. When people would say something to you, it just didn't match how you were thinking.
But I'm in this world, this traumatic brain injury world, right? Which is the world of Arabian Nights, where you don't know that you have no memory. Can you imagine not knowing that you have no memory? I mean, there's a movie about that, right? He wrote on his body or something like that. You're so disoriented. Distortions of reality is what they're called. You're so disoriented. There's not really a moment other than like in a dream, which is the experience that I had. I must be dreaming, because my moment of whatever the word is, my moment of aha was talking to my father and a friend who was visiting me and her brother who happened to be coming too, and saying, "But this is just a dream, right?" And my father said, "Why do you think you're dreaming?" Because that was the only way it made sense, right? So people disagreeing with me, where I would internally figure it out, oh, I must be in the South. So I'd look out the window, and the dream that I had about the window that night, that I had those nightmares with the little boy on the street, and it was worried about him because his mom left him outside in the middle of the night. I looked at out the window, and in the same room, there's a highway that you don't recognize a highway for anything from any other highway, but it was the Parkway. And I didn't recognize it as the Parkway because I was sure I was in the South. I mean, those basic, like, no awareness of self. I don't know where I am, when I am, who I am.
Tara, we have time for about 2 more questions. And
okay.
So there's a question in the chat, and then Mike Sheehan had his hand raised. So let me go to the question in the chat first. So the question's from Peter, and he asked, did you find that once some people got used to your injured self, they were reluctant to accept your growth out of that state?
See, this also goes to the student research that I read, and the group research that I read. I had this sort of like circumstantial, perfect situation, perfectly not good situation, but right after rehab, I went away where nobody knew me to law school, where everybody was terrified of failing. So, brain injured or not. So I was just like everybody. I had a secret that I didn't tell anybody. And so nobody really could judge me until I said, why don't I if they're going to give me this stupid extra time, why don't I just take it? Because it'll give me a leg up. And then once you like disclose only to the teachers, then you sort of start to feel like that. My family, or the people, friends and family close to me who knew all the way through, even though I was in DC, I mean, for sure, people spoke loudly to me, and an uncle asked if I saw the white light and that kind of thing. And I've definitely had, and then jobs that I've taken since law school. So jobs as an attorney, I've had people judge my ability, which is like not legal, but judge my ability based on the fact that I've had brain injury, and decide the reason that things that I produced were the way they were, or, so the answer is yes, I have.
Maybe now Mike Sheehan has a question. You could unmute yourself and ask Tara.
Thanks. Hi, Tara. Long time no see.
Hi. Yes.
How are you? So I have a very quick question. So I'm obviously new to this environment. But I do see a lot of parallels between what you talked about with regard to positive self-identity after brain injury with the types of methods used to change just human behaviors in general. And so, for example, we tell ourselves with negative self-talk over time, certain stories about ourselves. And the more we tell ourselves, the more we believe that, right? So when it comes to behavior change, redefining that narrative of self is often what's needed as a first step towards creating lasting change. And I wanted to see if you could comment on whether you see those same similarities, and also if you can speak to your experience of changing your own self-narrative after your injury.
So I really wish I could have spoken. I'm going to find this stinking page. Spoken about Sarah D. Morris. She wrote this incredible article about. So I'm just going to summarize it. The way she proposed that self-narrative is effective in treatment of brain injury is that you view self not as one thing. Not I believe, and through my recovery, believe that, and it was fine because it worked because I was unaware of any change. That there's one self, that I am a fighter and I'm going to be fine. My narrative, according to my parents, was you're going to get back to 100% from the first day, 100%. There's no room for anything else. 100% the whole way. Not because they're super positive people, but because it was such a devastating. So it devastated. I was like horribly, horribly injured. There was no choice. There were not like 5 options. It was, she's going to get better. That's it. But Sarah Morris talks about self as changeable. You have to forget that one stuff. Forget that true self is what she calls it. So you have to view this self as changeable. And the way that it is created is through conversations, language, narrative, language or communication between people. And so every conversation makes you different, right? The feedback makes you different. Which goes back to my question, like, why are these football players different? Well, right, because it has to do with that complex neurological thing that happens when you adapt to the change, when you update your personality. You don't I guess you press whatever, refresh, but you don't press anything. It just refreshes for you. So you would have a more like graceful progression into whatever the next step is or whatever the change to is than a person with brain injury who can't do that updating. They're just different and they're like, this is not good. So if that answers your question, I hope that it did.
Yeah, thank you. Great job, by the way.
Oh,
Thank you. So we'd like to thank Tara today for her presentation. It was certainly, a great talk and, a really complex topic. And I think you did a wonderful job of breaking it down for us for sure. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending our talk today. We hope to see you all for our spring brainstorm session, which is going to be on March 17th with Mike at the Mic. When any more of our events or participating in any of our research, much of which can be done remotely, please check us out on the Kessler Foundation website.